Hey everyone, welcome to the Council of Trent podcast. I'm your host, Catholic Answers apologist and speaker, Trent Horn. I remember when I was in high school, this was shortly after my conversion. I remember I was hanging out with a friend at his house. We were watching videos on the internet, and he told me, hey, you got to see this one video called Zeitgeist, because there's a part of it that shows Jesus never existed. So this video's been out there for a while, and obviously, because I saw it in high school. And there's a lot of different rebuttals to it, though I might do a full-length rebuttal to Zeitgeist, because I haven't found any rebuttals that I've been super happy with, like that they're really comprehensive, go through the whole thing. But I wanted today to address one of the arguments that are made by people who claim Jesus never existed. So these people are called mythicists. They believe that Jesus was just a story or an allegory, and Christians came to believe he was a historical individual later. This is a radical fringe view in scholarship. There's only like a handful of people with PhDs in the relevant fields who believe this. You read Bart Ehrman, who is an agnostic scholar, big critic of Christianity. He wrote a book called Did Jesus Exist? Back in 2012. And in that book, he said that it's the opinion of virtually every expert on the planet that Jesus existed. But if you go on the internet, you go on YouTube, atheist YouTube channels, there is a very high percentage of people who believe Jesus did not exist, and coincidentally, it's among people who are very active in the atheist community. That's not a coincidence. They already have a bias against Christianity, and so they're more likely to want to accept this thesis than someone else, because if there were no Jesus, there could have been no resurrection, no miracles, or anything like that. So I want to address one of the arguments that's used to try to claim that Jesus never existed. And it's the argument from ancient silence. So this argument says that if Jesus really did exist and he performed miracles, rose from the dead, things like that, more ancient historians and writers would have written about Jesus. They would have said, hey, there was this guy who rose from the dead in Judea, in Jerusalem, and yet they don't. And so this is the argument from ancient silence. Here is how Zeitgeist briefly mentions the argument. Here's what they say.
You would think that a guy who rose from the dead and ascended into heaven for all eyes to see and performed the wealth of miracles acclaimed to him would have made it into the historical record. It didn't, because once the evidence is weighed, there are very high odds that the figure known as Jesus did not even exist.
Okay, before I talk about what's wrong with the argument that Zeitgeist and other mythicists make, I want to talk about arguments from silence in general. They're not always fallacies or errors in reasoning. The argument from silence says, look, if historical event X happened, we would expect evidence Y. Evidence Y does not exist, or we have not found evidence Y. Therefore, historical event X did not happen. So you can reach incorrect conclusions with an argument from silence. But you can also reach helpful conclusions. Like I think, for example, that the Acts of the Apostles, because it does not mention the destruction of Jerusalem, the death of Paul, or the death of Peter, that to me provides good evidence that Acts of the Apostles was written prior to the year 62, before these events take place, because it ends with Paul under house arrest. And so if Acts was written during this time, then Luke would have been written even before Acts. Not every historian buys this particular argument from silence, but I think that it has merit to it. And you can construct other arguments from silence that are even more potent. But the argument from silence for Jesus does not work. It does not work for several reasons. In order to show you why it doesn't work, this idea, Jesus didn't exist because all these ancient historians didn't mention him, let's do a summary of the argument, then I'll point out what's wrong with it. So when you ask mythicists, I would ask them, okay, what ancient historians are you talking about? That's what you should always do. And someone says, why didn't more ancient writers talk about Jesus? You can ask, who? Who would you have expected to write about Jesus? 9 times out of 10, they can't give you a list because they've just heard the argument summarized by other people. Freak and Gandhi are their last names. They wrote a book called The Jesus Mysteries. They make this argument. They cite 24 people. I think I have a list here. I think there's 40 people on this list I have here. I'll put it up on the screen. It's Remsburg's list. Remsburg was a mythicist, an atheistic writer. He wrote a book in 1909 called The Christ, And that was a big heyday for mythicism. A lot of people were promoting mythicism, and then it died out in that period when it was debunked. And he had a list, I think almost near 40 authors, saying that these people did not mention Jesus, so Jesus probably did not exist. Let me see. I don't know if I can read through them all. Philo, Seneca, Pliny the Elder, Suetonius, Juvenal, Martial, Persius, Plutarch, Justus, Apollonius, Quintilian, Lucanus, Epictetus, Silius Italicus, Statius, Ptolemy, Hermogenes, Valerius, Maximus, Arrian, Petronius, Dion, Prusius, Paterculus. I'll take a break there. That's halfway through the list. Let's see if I can do the rest in one breath. Appian, Theon of Smyrna, Phlegon, Pompon Quintus Curtius, Lucian, Pausanias, Valerius Flaccus, Florus Lucius, Favorinus, Phaedrus, Damus, Alice Gellius, Columella, Diochrysostom, Lysias, Appian of Alexandria. Whew. Now here's the thing. When someone throws a big list at you like this, like, why didn't these people mention Jesus? It could be overwhelming. You're like, wow, look at all these authors, and why didn't they? But remember this old saying, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So, but the problem is a lot of people don't have the free time to debunk this stuff. But I do. And that's why I want to serve other people. So I went through and looked up all of these authors. And I specifically wanted to look at when were they born? When did they die? Where did they live? And what did they write? And because then I can see if they actually wrote it. Now, here's the problems to the argument. Number one, there are ancient authors who do mention Jesus. Josephus, Tacitus is another one. They're not on this list because Remsburg says those are forgeries. Well, they're not. I'll cover that in a future video. But Suetonius, for example, on here, he does talk about how there was an instigation, a fight amongst the Jews over someone named Chrestus. That the Jews were fighting, Claudius expelled them from Rome, and the Jews were fighting over someone called Chrestus. Now, that could be a reference to Christus, or Christ, that Jews and Christians were fighting about. It's not a slam dunk, but I think it points in that direction. So some of the people are on this list. There's another one, Lucian of I think it's Lucian of Samosata, Remsburg is talking about here. But that one provides a very helpful insight. I'll get into here shortly. The second point I would raise is this. There were a lot of ancient writers who did mention Jesus, but they're not on this list. Think about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Paul, Peter, James, Jude, the author of the letter to the Hebrews, Ignatius of Antioch, Papias, Polycarp of Smyrna, Irenaeus, Quadratus, Tatian the Syrian. Now what the mythicists will say is, oh, those are Christian writers, they don't count. Well, they're ancient writers, why don't they count? So what this person is saying is, I want these ancient, non-Christian sources to talk about how there was a guy named Jesus who rose from the dead and did miracles. Because here's the thing, if these ancient non-Christian sources, if they thought that Jesus was just a rabbi, they would have no reason to write about him. If they thought he really did rise from the dead, well, then they would be Christian sources, right? They wouldn't be non-Christian. So the mythicist wants me to show me all these ancient non-Christian writers writing about a guy rising from the dead, doing miracles, but they don't believe the guy actually did any miracles. Well, if they thought he was a huckster or a charlatan, they probably wouldn't write about him at all. So that's another problem right there. But here's the biggest problem with this list. There are only two ways any authors on this list would end up writing about Jesus. Either they witnessed Jesus' miracles firsthand, or they heard Christians tell them about these miracles. So let's say that they just heard Christians talking about these miracles, right? And they wrote it down. Suppose some of these authors did do that. Would that help? Would that show the mythicists that they're wrong? Not in the slightest. Because what the mythicists, they say is, well, Pliny the Younger, he wrote about how he persecuted Christians. Well, he arrested them, and he would persecute them if they refused to worship the pagan gods. He arrested them because they seemed suspicious. They would get together at dawn and pray, and he's thinking, what are you guys, rebels? What's going on here? Look, just pray to Jupiter, pray to the Roman gods, and you'll be on your way. And the Christians would do that, and then they would be sent off to the lions for doing that. So Pliny, he says, these Christians worship Christ as to a god. Okay, so Pliny writes about that, but what the mythicists will say is, okay, Pliny is just an example that Christians believed in Jesus. Later Christians believed in Jesus, not that Jesus actually existed. The same as there's a name on here between Curtius and Pausanias, Lucian. I don't know who Remsburg is referring to here. If it is Lucian of Samosata, then we have a problem, because Lucian of Samosata, he says in the Passing of Peregrinus, he talks about Christians. He makes fun of them. This is about the middle of the 2nd century. He says Christians still worship the man who was crucified in Palestine because he introduced this new cult into the world. Okay? So Lucian's on the list, but he does mention Jesus. And the mythicists will say, so what? He's just telling us what Christians already told him. So there's only two ways. Either they saw the miracles firsthand or Christians told them about it. If Christians told them about it, a mythicist isn't going to care because they're just repeating what you can get from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the Gospels. They want an ancient, non-Christian writer who witnessed firsthand what Jesus did and still didn't become Christian and then tells us about it. Like, you're creating a criteria that nobody can meet. And the fact of the matter is, the majority of the names on this list, they could have only known about Jesus from Christians telling them about it. And most of these people, I would say nearly all of them, don't even talk about Christians. But we know Christians existed in the 1st century. We know that. That's a fact. Even a mythicist can't deny there were Christians. He might say they didn't believe in a historical Jesus, but he'll say there were Christians. So if these historians don't mention Christians even, why would they mention Jesus? Because they're not even familiar with the only source that they have for who Jesus is. So either they never met Christians, so they couldn't write about Jesus, or they might have met a Christian and just dismissed it or not written about it because they didn't care about that, because that's not what they wrote about. Only a small minority of these names are even historians. So let me go through some of these names. Well, let me go through the ones, I'll talk about the ones that could have only heard from Christians because they lived in the wrong time period. Appian, Alasgellius, Favorinus, Lucius, Flaccus, Pausanias. These people all lived later. They except for Flaccus, they operated in the 2nd century. And they wrote on different subjects. Flaccus wrote about Jason and the Argonauts. Pausanias was a geographer. We've got poets, people only about Roman history and nothing else. Phlegon wrote he lived in Greece. He might have mentioned the eclipse in Jerusalem. That's a bit disputed. He might have talked about an eclipse and about the darkness when Jesus died, but we're not entirely sure. Theon only wrote about mathematics. There's other people on this list, by the way. They could not have been there, not only because they lived in the wrong place to hear about it. Most of these people lived in either, let me bring up a map here of the ancient Roman Empire. So this would be the ancient Roman Empire from 117 AD, around the time of Emperor Trajan, when most of these historical figures on Remsburg's list, when they lived. This was the Roman Empire at its greatest extent, goes up halfway through the British Isles, out to Spain, goes very far east into the Middle East, into Iraq, Egypt, Northern Africa, Greece, Italy, Baltic states here. Very large extent of the empire. Most of these ancient writers lived in Spain, southern France, Italy, or Greece. Some of them lived in Alexandria, which is closer to Egypt, but so either they were geographically removed, they were removed too far in time, they didn't write about the subject. I'll give you a few other examples. Columnella wrote about trees. That's the only thing Columella wrote about, trees. Diochrysostom lived in Turkey, not that far away, which is Asia Minor back then. Wrote on other random stuff. One of his works is called On Praise of Hair. Hey, even people back in that early time liked hair. So when you go through these individuals, they lived too far away, and they were born after the time of Jesus' ministry. So they could not have been firsthand witnesses to it. Or they were born too early. So you have someone like Paterculus. Paterculus wrote on Roman history, but his histories go only up to the year 30. And of course, that's when Jesus' ministry began. So we wouldn't expect him to write on Jesus since he was done writing about history. So I've narrowed it down. Okay, so the people who could have possibly been first century witnesses of Jesus and what happened, even though they never converted based on seeing this. Like I said, Columella wrote on trees. He lived from 4 to 70, didn't write on history. And he lived in Spain. Curtius wrote on Alexander the Great. He lived in Rome. Phaedrus wrote fables. Rhymes kind of. You go to all these other individuals, Pliny the Elder, Seneca, Valerius Maximus. Maximus's works were published till 30-31. He's out. So you can start crossing off a lot of these names because they might have heard from Christians, but that wouldn't have mattered. They didn't care, or they wrote on a different subject, and so they didn't care. They just dismissed this as just pious legends, or they didn't know about it, or once again, they didn't care about it. Or they did write on histories, and they didn't write in this time period. They didn't have access to this particular area. There are only 4 names on the list that I think have any possibility of bolstering the case here for the mythicist. That would be, the first would be, let's bring it up here, Apollonius and Damas. Apollonius and Damas were believed to have lived in Asia Minor, so nearby, in the 1st century. They would have been teenagers or adults during the time of Jesus' ministry. But here's the problem. Our only source for Apollonius and Damas comes from a guy named Philostratus. He was writing a biography of Apollonius of Tyana because he was a miracle worker, allegedly, and wanted to make a temple to compete with Christians. So Apollonius was the competition for Christians. He was the competition. And the first biography of him comes from the 3rd century. Centuries later, it's just not reliable. Apollonius didn't even write anything. That'd be from Damas, one of his disciples, who we can't reconstruct what he wrote because it's too far removed anyways. The other one would be Philo. Philo was a Jewish philosopher living in Alexandria, so right nearby Israel, but Christianity probably just barely got to Alexandria by the time he was finished with his own writings. And this is a conclusion Bart Ehrman reaches. I think Richard Carrier, another prominent mythicist, even reaches that conclusion. We shouldn't be surprised Philo didn't write about this. He died in the year 50, so Christianity, by the time it would have reached Alexandria for him to write about it or hear about it, he probably was done with his writings by that time. Finally, we have Justus of Tiberius. He was born in the late 1st century. He was probably a contemporary of the Jewish historian Josephus, who does mention Jesus. We'll talk about that in a future episode. He was born in Tiberias, so he was from the area where Jesus performed his miracles, but he does not mention Jesus. Well, we don't have Justus's works. They haven't survived the present day, which is another argument. Some of these people could have written about Jesus, and their works haven't survived to the present day. Oh, by the way, some of the names on this list, like Epictetus, Apollonius, they didn't even write anything. So it's like, why didn't they write anything? Well, they didn't write anything. Other people on this list, they wrote stuff, but their works haven't survived to the present day. Papias wrote a 5-volume series on the church in the early 2nd century. It's lost. We only have fragments of it preserved in Eusebius. So there's a lot of writings. 99% of ancient writings have not survived to the present day. What we do have on Jesus is remarkable. I mean, compare him to Pontius Pilate. The only thing we have on Pilate is some writings in Philo and Josephus, just a few things. Nothing Pilate wrote himself. A line, for Roman historians, only one line in Tacitus connecting him to Jesus, some coins, and the Pilate headstone with his name on it, discovered in Caesarea Maritima in 1962. But that's for the procurator of an entire region. Jesus was an itinerant preacher. You either believed he was God, and so you would talk about him a bunch, or you believed he was a fake and a charlatan, and you wouldn't give him the time of day. So back to Justus. So Justus of Tiberias wrote a history of the Jewish kings, hasn't survived to the present day. Photius, though, talks about it, another medieval writer, I believe, saying that Justus did not mention Jesus in his history of Jewish kings. Well, that makes sense because Justus never became Christian. And I have a book on my shelf, the Oxford History of the Papacy by J.N.D. Kelly. Guess what? It doesn't include Pope Michael, the guy who lives in Kansas, who thinks he's the Pope, who isn't. So if you wrote a history of Jewish kings, you're not going to include a crucified rabbi that people later came to worship, because that's the exact opposite of what a Jewish king should be. So great. Well, I hope that was helpful for you all. There's a lot of great resources out there to combat mythicism. I cover some of it in my book, Counterfeit Christs, I would recommend. Bart Ehrman's book actually is a decent treatment of mythicism. I don't agree with everything he says about Jesus because he's an agnostic, of course, but it's still a worthwhile resource. But hey, thank you guys so much, and I hope you have a very blessed day. Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you want to help us produce more great content like this, be sure to click subscribe and go to TrentHornPodcast.com to become a premium subscriber. You'll help us create more videos like this and get access to bonus content and sneak peeks of our upcoming projects.